It's time for you and me to stand up for ourselves.
Obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork and just dumb enough to passively accept all these increasingly shittier jobs with the lower pay, the longer hours, the reduced benefits, the end of overtime, and the vanishing pension that disappears the minute you go to collect it. And now they're coming for your Social Security money. They want your fucking retirement money. They want it back so they can give it to their criminal friends on Wall Street. And you know something? They'll get it. They'll get it all from you sooner or later because they own this fucking place. It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
Welcome to Unwashed and Unruly. Our regular listeners, hi to all three of you, must be wondering, where are the dulcet tones of Lola? Have no fear, Lola is here. But we thought we'd throw you a curveball with a hint of torture apropos of today's topic by having me introduce the podcast. Today, we are discussing the Epstein files. Yep. And to help us unpack 3.5 million files in about an hour, we have two unruly gals, investigative fact-checker extraordinaire, Lola Michaels.
Hey, everyone.
And popular catacrotic pulse reader, Cam Cruz.
Hi, everybody. I have no idea what catacrotic means.
I am the unwashed Ezra Said. Grab your shovels, everyone. We're about to go digging through piles of bullshit so high that Mount Everest has neck pains from having to look up. On January 30, the U.S. Department of Justice released over 3 million files related to Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein hardly needs an introduction. A convicted trafficker and pedophile accused by numerous women of rape, torture, and the trading in human flesh. Epstein was arrested in 2019 and expediently died while in prison, sparing the numerous powerful men, and some women, in his circle the inconvenience of potential blackmail or being named for a plea deal. We are solemnly informed it was suicide. A view into the sordid world of Epstein reveals connections with U.S. presidents and politicians, titans of industry and finance, Clinton and Trump, who faces accusations of rape and assault in the latest dump, British royals and politicians, Gulf state sheiks, the likes of Bill Gates, Google's Sergey Brin, Leon Black, Jamie Dimon, head of J.P. Morgan Chase, Les Wexner, most popularly known as the head of Victoria's Secret, former Barclays CEO Jess Stanley, who exchanged emails with Epstein about Snow White and Beauty and the Beast, and he was not referring to the Disney films. And of course, there's Ehud Barak, former Israeli Prime Minister, Foreign and Defense Minister, and head of military intelligence. He was being familiarized with one Peter Thiel and Palantir. In this episode, we will unpack Epstein. Our starting point is that this was not just a criminal ring involving an ever-growing number of the wealthy and powerful. If nothing else, and to be honest, it will probably be nothing else, the Epstein files should provide a teaching moment. This is not an Epstein class or a transatlantic cabal. This is a social class defined by its relationship to the means of production, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist rulers. And there's hardly a conspiracy there. It's out in the open. They openly collaborate on killing tens of millions around the world, including in a live-streamed genocide. They engineer the destruction of tens of millions of lives at home, openly declaring that we must be impoverished so they can live like kings and maraud the planet. We are recording this episode on Saturday, March 7th, about a week into the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. The war began with the murdering of Ayatollah Khamenei, not only the head of the state in Iran, but a major spiritual and clerical leader of Shia Islam. That same day, the Americans bombed a school in a small Iranian town, snuffing out over 160 little girls between 7 and 12 years old, and about a dozen of their teachers. A little too close on the nose for these people. Anyone with a pulse and a half-decent impulse would want Iran to win this war and the U.S. to lose it. What the Epstein files and other events like the genocide in Gaza and the mass slaughter of Iranians should underline is that there is a direct line between the moral depravity in the files and the moral depravity the ruling class ostentatiously displays on a daily basis. In fact, the degenerate buying and selling of young women was the side hustle to the far larger enterprise of commanding the heights of international capital and with it the world. And in this, Epstein was a cog, a powerful cog, in the machine of bourgeois class rule, which includes figures far more powerful than he was. At the end of the day, what the Epstein files give us through its small window into this perverse world is ammo to imbue class hatred. Hate thy enemy. Okay, so let's start with a question to both of you. What is your biggest takeaway from these Epstein files? Let's start with you, Cam.
So guys, we owe Roseanne an apology. It turns out that Roseanne was right, and a lot of the craziest things the conspiracy theorists were saying were actually true. When you go through the emails, not only is there sex trafficking of adult women, but there's sex trafficking of children, there's torture, there's murder. It's really just mind-blowing. And one of the things that I think has been unmooring for me is a lot of the emails have language that's clearly coded. And, you know, people have been saying pizza means kids. Maybe pizza does mean kids. There's weird fucking pizza shit in there. People have been talking about eating babies, and there's this weird stuff in there about cream cheese. Maybe cream cheese is about eating babies. I honestly don't even know what to believe anymore and what's real because of how crazy these files are. Like, maybe Gina Davis has been implanted in Selena Gomez, guys. Magic might be real. Who fucking knows anymore? These files are crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've been talking about this episode for like over a month and looking through everything. And I guess the main takeaway for me is we live in a fucked up society run by criminals and nothing is too far for them. I mean, the latest release, which is 3 million files, is the most flattering version of events. So it's like 1% of all the stuff that they do in secret. And everyone is in there. Like Ezra, you mentioned, like Republicans, Democrats, business people, diplomats, philanthropists, healers, professors, scientists, you know, Larry Summers, Alan Dershowitz, Woody Allen, Deepak Chopra, Noam Chomsky. Like they all knew, they were all interwoven and connected. So it's this huge coterie of pals and patrons and perpetrators. And like George Carlin said, it is a big club and you're not in it. But I think there are two problems. The first is that these same people, as you mentioned, Ezra, are committing far greater evils out in the open. And the second one, which is also related, is that the entire narrative has been about sex trafficking and sexual abuse, which is depraved, with thousands of victims over decades. But focusing entirely on this case as one of sexual misconduct just really dilutes and distracts from the entire financial, military, and intelligence linked networks around Epstein that were completely shielded from scrutiny. So, you know, there's connections to currency traders that destroyed entire economies and, you know, these elaborate ties to intelligence and the Mossad and Israel. And I don't know, the sense that I got is that Epstein is this front for a broader network of imperialist interests, as you said, a social class. He was part of this extensive financial infrastructure. These people pull the strings on everything. And like, once you pull the thread, you're looking at the entire bourgeoisie, basically.
So what is your biggest takeaway, Ezra? What do you think?
Well, my biggest takeaway is captured very well by the Bolshevik leader, Leon Trotsky, where he said, the life of the upper circles of the bourgeoisie is a continuous chain of hidden crimes, of legal and illegal thefts, of cynical deceptions. What is revealed to the public is only a tiny fraction of the filth that accumulates behind the high walls of their mansions and the closed doors of their private clubs. That was written in 1928. And my biggest takeaway is basically in that framework. What we see is an utterly depraved ruling class doing some of the most horrendous crimes to individual girls and women, but it's completely in line with everything they do around the world. To them, we are tools to be used, and when a tool is no longer useful or effective, you throw it away. And that's what we are to them. I mentioned in the opening that it's not an Epstein class. And the reason I wanted to say that is because if you call it an Epstein class, it actually is part of the cover-up. This is actually how the capitalist ruling class functions on a daily basis. This is what they do. When you run a system that is based on brutal exploitation and the most violent dispossession of the overwhelming masses of people, that's what you do on a daily basis. We're just getting a little taste of it. And everything that's been said and done about this in the media has itself been part of the cover-up. If you focus entirely on the pedophilia, that's part of the cover-up. If Prince Andrew is taken out and shot tomorrow, it's part of the cover-up. If every single member of the Epstein cabal who appears in these files is shot off the planet tomorrow, it's part of the cover-up. It's all part of the cover-up because if you maintain the same capitalist system and the same ruling class, they'll just get replaced by a new crop.
I think in terms of what role he played, the conclusion that I got was that he was a power broker type. He provided these services to the financial rulers, and so learned a lot in the process of reading about these files about compromat, when damaging information is used as a weapon for blackmail and extortion and political sabotage. Everyone talks about like his properties being for these sexual escapades, but they were also to capture sexual crimes on camera. So they were like full of surveillance. And so like once a world leader or some famous person would be like recorded in a compromising act, then they would be compromised essentially. I mean, I don't think I had this much information going into this, like how much intelligence agencies would grant him immunity for this information. There's also a lot of crazy stuff that I know Cam was looking into, and you can go down so many rabbit holes, like genetic editing, this sick idea of that Epstein had in terms of his DNA and being obsessed with DNA sequencing and mapping genetic traits and, transhumanism. Like there's a whole bunch of really dark stuff that we have looked at in the last month.
I agree. I'd also add to that the truth of what we are seeing is, I think, worse than any conspiracy theory out there. Because what the conspiracy theories often portray is that there is a normal working of things, and then there's this secret cabal that work behind the scenes and do all these evil deeds in a cloak and dagger sort of way. And the reality is this, I'm just going to keep repeating this theme. This is how it works on a daily basis. And all that we're seeing is just a glimpse into the life of a class whose whole existence is based on the degradation of everybody else. Or to put it in a different way, it is so shocking that the people who rape and murder millions around the globe on a daily basis through everything from bombings to starvation would mistreat little girls. But let's move on. How would you characterize the reaction to the file dump itself? Do people even know what's in there? Like in general, outside of those who are involved in reading and following social media?
I think you only know about this stuff if you're chronically online, because it's not really being talked about in any significant way on the major news networks. And dump is the only word you can use to describe it, because it's a completely overwhelming amount of information that was handed to us. There's no organization to it. And some people have been doing some really great work trying to get it organized. Somebody created a website called Gmail, which is an interface of Gmail. So you can kind of use it just like you use your Gmail and search through the files that way. But one of the things that's also added to the difficulty around organizing this is that it's actually changing. I was listening to a podcast called First Degree Podcast, and these women who host the podcast have been trying to organize all this information. And one of the things they notice is that the files are disappearing in real time. So they'll look up the word pizza and it'll have 800 hits one day. And then they look the next day and it has 600 hits. So they've been actually screenshotting everything. And a lot of people I know are working on that because, like I said, it's constantly changing. So it's completely overwhelming. It's constantly changing. One thing I saw that was really interesting was a quote by this lawyer. Her name is Daphne Delvaux. And she is, she kind of brands herself as like a lawyer mom. She specifically works with women in the workplace. And she had this great quote about how the way the files are released completely breaks courtroom protocol. So this is the quote that she posted on her Instagram page. It's a long quote, so I ended up just taking some excerpts from it. But here it is. Quote, "In trial practice, when exhibits involve violence or children, we don't dump the information into the room. The judge guides the process. Experts contextualize it. Courts understand that when the brain is flooded with horror, it stops thinking. A nervous system can hold horror only if it's sequenced, paced, and contextualized. What you're being fed is exposure to terror without containment. This is not sloppy. The most ruthless corporate defense lawyers fight cases this exact way. Disorganized dumps, endless data, no roadmap. Too much information while omitting the most crucial information. This is why trials involving extreme harm rely on structure. The law does not do this to protect perpetrators, but to protect the jury." So what she's saying here is that they're breaking like standard practice, and that practice is designed to allow people to process the information and judge it with their full brain working. But this is very intentionally being put out a certain way so that it's psychologically overwhelming, and it just feels like people are kind of drowning in this.
Yeah, I feel like everyone has seen, people hear like bits and pieces. Like they'll be like, oh, did you hear about the pizza or the grape juice? Or like, did you hear about Epstein like ordering hundreds of gallons of sulfuric acid, or like the 13-year-old who had sex with Trump and they dumped the baby? There's like bits and pieces that people hear, but the big picture is completely lost. And I agree with you, Cam. Like basically the FBI dumped these millions of files to the public and said, enjoy. Bassem Youssef, who's a comedian, called this like a TikTok challenge, And it, to me, it like actually made me think of that episode of Succession where Logan Roy throws sausages on the floor, playing Boar on the Floor. And it's like this psychological hazing game, And there's just so much dehumanization that comes with this tyrannical power structure. And we're the subordinates, and we have to like scramble to try to figure out, we have to do the work. And then we are accused of propagating conspiracy theories, right? Because we have to dig through all these freaking files, So I don't know. I guess what I found is that if you are not following leftists or independent researchers, then I don't see how you would get the whole picture of things. And I just want to give a shout out to the two intrepid journalists that we've been following pretty closely on this, or at least I've been following. And basically like what these two journalists did was they followed the money. And that's like what you're supposed to do with journalism, right? So the first is Whitney Webb, who just published a 2-volume book, One Nation Under Blackmail. And she rightly points out, it's not like Epstein's sex crimes were not real, but that the sex story is being used to like drown out the story about the system, basically. And then the other person is Nick Bryant, who's basically like single-handedly done more to expose Epstein ties to organized crime and blackmail than anyone. He also has an organization that's been advocating for the victims of Epstein, EpsteinJustice.com. And he's the one who got hold of the Black Book, the Epstein Black Book in 2012, which no one wanted to touch. He published it in 2015 along with the flight logs. So this was 4 years before Epstein was actually arrested in 2019. So Nick Bryant and Whitney Webb if you want the real story and the details. But otherwise, it's a nothing burger to the media.
That was actually going to be what I wanted to deal with next. What has the role of the media been? I mean, I'll tell you, one of the things I've seen is that I think kind of didn't fly very well, but they did try it really hard in the first few weeks after the files was dumped, was these insane articles that started appearing in American and British media about how Epstein was a Russian agent, when it's clear he was an agent of the powerful intelligence services of Micronesia. I mean,
yeah, dude, it's so annoying that the Russia thing came up. I couldn't even fucking believe that.
Yeah, I mean, everything always has to lead back to Russia.
All bad roads lead to Russia.
Yeah, and it's obviously that he was an agent of the Honduran terror.
I mean, there's just as much evidence to substantiate that as the Russia claim.
So
he did have multiple passports too.
Yes, he did. I mean, obviously, no one who works with the CIA or Mossad or or the feared Papua New Guinea intelligence service could possibly have multiple passports. But what has the role of the media been in all this? How is it reporting it? How is it concealing it?
Well, remember, like when we talk about the media, we're talking about in terms of the establishment media, like 6 media conglomerates, which are tied to the government, and they don't want to cover this at all because fundamentally that's their people. The people who run the media are cronies with all of them, and it's their social circles. So they're not going to address the abuse allegations as they didn't do for decades. And all the powerful figures are benefiting from the media and from sanitizing Epstein's image and people around them. Like, you know, we've seen that for years. So I wouldn't expect anything beyond this kind of nothing burger. I would also say that the Trump administration is releasing this very selective bit of Epstein documents at the time where they're deeply consolidating their network and their power over the media. So Twitter and TikTok and CBS and bullying these outlets into compliance and so on. So, I mean, I think that there's a reality behind that. Right now, what I'm getting from the media, it's just this kind of moral scandal, but that Epstein is dead. And so we can all kind of move on.
Yeah, the move on vibe is super strong because it doesn't seem like anybody's going to pay for any of this. It's like Jeffrey Epstein was the bad guy. He's out of the picture now and life goes on.
Yeah, they want to shield all of the financial and intelligence connections, right? They want to shield any of those individuals from scrutiny. But even before, like, I just want to go back to the 2 things that really stand out that people point to in terms of the coverage of this. Going back to 2002, journalist Vicky Ward was assigned to write this profile of Jeffrey Epstein for Vanity Fair. And during her reporting, she interviewed multiple women who alleged that Epstein had sexually abused them when they were teenagers. Okay, so this is 2002. And she included those allegations in drafts of the story. And then those allegations were removed from the final published piece. And instead, the piece focused entirely on like Epstein's wealth and his social network and like his mysterious financial background and nothing about the sexual abuse claims. And Vicky Ward says specifically that Epstein pressured her and the magazine and contacted the editor-in-chief directly. So fast forward 16 years, it wasn't until 2018 when Julie K. Brown from the Miami Herald wrote Perversion of Justice. And it was notable because she really aggressively like revisited areas that had not been revealed at all. And she talks a lot in her interviews today about the culture of intimidation from the media and why the national outlets didn't touch the story for 2 decades. The problem with a lot of her analysis, you know, she works very closely with the victims and their trauma and everything. But you know, she basically says, oh, there's no credible evidence that Epstein had any ties with intelligence or the State Department. And of course, intelligence agencies don't admit and turn over.
They don't have a website with like their staff members listed on it.
Yeah, exactly. And then, okay, so in 2019, a lot was out there when he was arrested, right? And they still didn't cover it. But people knew in 2019 that there were thousands of pages that were released that were, you know, Prince Andrew and top Democrats, and people knew about Epstein's sex trafficking activities, right?
I mean, this stuff existed in the rumor mill for a really long time.
Yeah, exactly. And so they knew at the time, 2019, people knew he was in the highest circles of society and hobnobbing with all these presidents and, you know, British royalty and billionaires, and that he was their money manager and stuff like that. But like no corporate media publication uncovered those links. And then after he died, everyone on social media was like, this was not a suicide. This was a murder or a homicide or whatever. Powerful individuals wanted to get rid of him. It was obvious that there was all this breakdown of surveillance cameras and guard staffing and record. You know, there were so many obvious holes in this quote unquote suicide story. But the New York Times denounced it as conspiracy theories, and then there was media silence. Today, the New York Times continues. So I want to just point out 2 articles in the New York Times, if this is where you're getting your information on Epstein. The first is it's a story called The Epstein Files in the Hidden World of an Unaccountable Elite, and it's by Robert Draper. Okay, so this is...
Don Draper's son.
Yeah. So this is all the news that's fit to print. In unsparing detail, the documents lay bare the once furtive activities of an unaccountable elite, largely made up of rich and powerful men from business, politics, academia, and show business. The pages tell a story of a heinous criminal given a free ride by the ruling class in which he dwelled. Probably the first time ruling class is in the New York Times.
I'm genuinely shocked to use that term.
All because he had things to offer them: money, connections, sumptuous dinner parties, a private plane, a secluded island, and in some cases, sex. Okay? And then it mentions people, like it mentions Ken Starr and Steve Bannon and Larry Summers. But then it goes on to complain about the main problem with this is conspiracy theories. It goes on. The shocking nature of some of the revelations, combined with the prominence and status of those in Mr. Epstein's orbit, has done nothing to quiet the conspiracy theories that his behavior spawned and that both the right and the left have sought to weaponize for political advantage. If anything, the raft of new details has spiraled into feverish new speculation with little or no factual basis.
So are they like saying that the Epstein file shouldn't have been released because it fuels conspiracies?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because another article by the New York Times that recently came out that Ezra shared with us, the Epstein files should never have been released, by Daniel Richman. And he says, every day seems to bring new reports of financiers, academics, politicians, and royalty, among others, who cozied up to Jeffrey Epstein, a convicted sex offender whose predation took a horrendous toll on innocent lives. With accountability for people in power in short supply, it can be hard to see a downside in the huge dump of documents relating to Mr. Epstein and his various associates. But we should recognize the release of millions of pages of the Epstein files as both a sign of institutional failure and a cause for concern. If our justice system were working properly, the public would never have such access. The release of such files is also cause for concern because so much of the raw investigative material in them, untold layers of hearsay, unverified accusations, and vague circumstantial connections, ought not to be released for the public to pick over. Do your fucking job, New York Times.
Well, they are actually.
Yeah, that's true. They are.
They are. Because this line about the public should never have seen this is, if the justice system were working properly, he's right. He's right. From the bourgeoisie's point of view, he's right. And just want to make a point. If you never pick up the New York Times in your life, it doesn't matter. What the New York Times role is it sets the tone of how other media, so-called respectable media, are supposed to cover this, because it is the paper of record for the American bourgeoisie, including those sections of the bourgeoisie who will denounce it as a left-wing, blah, blah, blah. It is still their paper of record. It is the most prominent newspaper in the United States. And when it sets the tone, others follow. So when they say these things, they're correct from their class's point of view. And the New York Times was among those who talked about not the intelligence services of Liechtenstein, but rather the intelligence services of Russia. They tried that line. Like I said, it didn't land very well.
They threw the Russia spaghetti at the wall and none of it stuck.
Yeah. Because it's the level of absurdity.
So I just want to go back to this conspiracy thing, because the whole premise of these articles is the internet is evil, conspiracies will spread. And I mean, the real truth is, like, they don't want these crimes exposed to the little underlings that they exploit. And the CIA came up with the term conspiracy theory as a way to discredit people. And I think what Cam was saying about the almost like the psychology of exhaustion, like throwing everything to people and just being like, you know, the establishment media is like, oh, it's just another Friday on the farm, you know, but like social media is blowing up and we're trying to figure out what's real and what's not. And I feel like that's by design psychologically, so that we're kind of like, is this true? Is this not? Who could know?
Exactly. They threw out 3.5 million files and let the clods dig through them. And they can just say, well, it's unsubstantiated. It's just an accusation. And we move on with our lives.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting evidence coming out that Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein were really, really active online trying to influence the narrative and keep this all this activity in the realm of conspiracy. So there is a 4chan sub called World News Sub, and the person who is the moderator for that sub, their screen name was Maxwell Hill. And all of their online activity correlates with where Ghislaine Maxwell was living at the time. So while she was in London, all of the posts were happening during daytime hours in London. And when she got arrested, all of the posting stopped. But within that sub, it was like a right-wing conspiracy theory type sub, and it like lumped in the Epstein stuff with the reptilians and the flat earth theory and all these other like wacky things. So there's a lot of people saying that there was a concerted effort to make it sound like this stuff was crazy talk and like leave it in the realm of conspiracy.
Yeah. And then the people I talk to, they're like, oh, it's impossible to know what's true or not, you know? Like,
That's the point.
yeah, exactly. You distrust the news, but you also distrust your ability to know the truth. You can't change anything. Like, you're just like, well, who knows, you know? And then we're just stuck in this limbo.
Yeah, totally. And I think we're at this point where what use is knowing the truth if nothing is going to happen anyway? Because,
Exactly.
you know, Jeffrey Epstein has been operating with a certain amount of impunity for his entire life. If you go back to the 80s, Jeffrey Epstein has ties with the CIA, with British intelligence. We've talked a little bit about his tie to Israeli intelligence. One of the things that really illustrates the level of immunity that he had was in the late 80s, in the early 90s, he was involved with a Ponzi scheme with this dude named Steven Hoffenberger, and they committed one of the largest Ponzi schemes in American history, where they defrauded investors almost $500 million. Guys, Steven Hoffenberger got 20 years in prison. Jeffrey Epstein was his equal partner in this. He didn't even get charged. So it shows that he was being protected. If we go to the first time Jeffrey Epstein is actually charged related to his Palm Beach activities, he's also let off the hook with his lawyers colluded with the DOJ and with Alexander Acosta and got him this really sweetheart deal. So his plea deal was lessened to the point where it didn't even include any sort of crimes against children. And his sentence was like fucking insane, dude. Any other person would have went to jail for life. And he ended up going, instead of to state prison, to the county jail. And while he was there, he had a private wing where he was allowed to leave his cell door open. He had a TV and computer access. He was allowed to turn off his lights at night. He had private security. One of the terms
He was allowed
of
to leave
his...
during the day. And
Well, yeah. One of the terms of his sentencing was that he had to have sex offender therapy, and they allowed him to hire his own therapist instead of using somebody in the courts. And like Lola just said, he was granted work release on a charge that doesn't even allow for work release, only a couple weeks after entering jail. And the work release program is fucking crazy. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, he's allowed to leave. And he was picked up and dropped off by his personal drivers. And a lot of people say he was committing sex crimes while he was in jail on work release. So yeah, you don't get that kind of sweetheart deal unless you know a lot of people in high places. And another interesting thing about that is, in a 2007 interview, Alexander Acosta was asked, why did Jeffrey Epstein get off so lightly? And he said that he was told to stand down, that Jeffrey Epstein was intelligence and that he couldn't, slam him.
yeah, so Nick Bryant talks a lot about this. And that sweetheart deal was when the Palm Beach police had launched this investigation. They found 23 victims. They were going to arrest him. As you said, Cam, like, it was given to the grand jury and a special prosecutor. These victims were skewered at the time, and they were like,
And they were high school girls, most of them, let me
they
say.
were called prostitutes. And Epstein was not indicted on sexual abuse of a minor. And so, yeah, the cop behind this went to the Department of Justice, and Acosta did not impanel a grand jury, but put together that sweetheart deal. And Nick Bryant has a lot to say on this, so let's hear what he has to say.
That deal is so dirty. And then Alexander Acosta was getting vetted by the Trump administration. He was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District. He was getting vetted by the Trump administration as labor secretary. And he was asked, why did you go so light on Epstein? And he said, I was told that Jeffrey Epstein was intelligence, and I had to stand down. It was above my pay grade. And now, there's only, and I looked into this, and I've talked to various legal scholars, there's only two people in the government that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the attorney general, and one is the president. And this was in 2007. So the attorney general was Alberto Gonzales, and the president was George Bush II. And I can't imagine that an attorney general is going to tell a U.S. attorney to cover up a nationwide pedophile network without getting the okay from his boss, the president. He's not going to go out on a limb like that. So the Epstein case was covered up at the very apex of the Bush II administration. And then the Obama administration continued the cover up, and the Biden administration, and also the Trump administration.
Jokes aside about his supposed connections to Russian intelligence and the Russian government, I think anybody looking at this can't help but see connections to Israeli intelligence, as well as the American intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA. So what do you guys see coming out of this? Is he connected to Israeli intelligence?
I mean, obviously, we don't actually know whether or not he was actual Mossad agent. He definitely had ties to those circles, along with his lawyer, Alan Dershowitz. He had an extensive personal relationship with Ehud Barak, like you mentioned, and also the IDF, the Israeli military. What we do know is that Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was definitely a Mossad agent. So he was an espionage operative, and he died falling or being pushed off a yacht in 1991. And basically, Ghislaine Maxwell, along with Epstein, I think continued Robert Maxwell's criminal operations, which included like human trafficking.
And might I add that after his death, he was buried on the Mount of Olives, which is the highest honor for a Mossad agent.
The most authoritative voices. I mean, like, I'm not an authoritative voice on the CIA, but there are authoritative voices on intelligence. One of them is John Kiriakou. So John Kiriakou was a CIA spy. He was imprisoned for leaking classified information, so he's a whistleblower. And he really knows spies. And so he was actually asked this question on a program called The Diary of a CEO. So I think we can just listen to what he had to say.
Do you think Jeffrey Epstein was a spy?
I believe very strongly he was a spy, yes.
And who do you think he was working for?
The Israelis. I'm confident it was the Israelis.
Why?
Jeffrey Epstein is kind of the stereotypical example that they give you in training for what's called an access agent. This is a different kind of recruit. So, for example, if you're a foreign intelligence service and you want information, like close-in information from a former president, from the CEO of the biggest company in the world, from a member of the British royal family, you're not going to recruit these guys. You're not going to recruit Bill Clinton or Bill Gates or Prince Andrew. So you do the next best thing. You recruit somebody who has regular access to them. And that person that you recruit is going to need to make these people feel comfortable and appreciated. And so you give him plenty of money. So he has this house on an island, or he has the whole island. And maybe you bring in young girls, you get them in compromising positions, just in case you need to use what's called compromat, compromising pictures. We know now that Jeffrey Epstein's house on the island had video cameras, hidden video cameras in literally every room, including the bathrooms. Why? Why would he care what was going on unless it was to use that information against people? As I said, only the Israelis and the Russians use extortion as a motivator.
So would they have made Jeffrey Epstein rich?
Yeah.
In order to give him that access?
Yes.
How could they have done that?
Oh, that's easy. I mean, you do. I mean, governments are the only ones really that can launder money unfettered. And you can also do it through real estate, through fine art, and through horses. Those are the three easiest ways to launder money today. Fine art, real estate, and racehorses.
But presumably he would have spoken out at some point, no? He would have said something? Or
No. But it would explain why he got a sweetheart deal in 2006. I mean, this is a guy that's been convicted of child sex crimes. And he gets 6 months of house arrest with an ankle bracelet? And we have mandatory minimums in this country. That's a 5-year mandatory minimum, first offense.
He definitely had some interesting power, didn't he?
Mm-hmm.
I would dispute the idea that the U.S. doesn't use extortion and honey traps and things like
Right.
that. But I'm in no position to offer the hard evidence. I just know that intelligence services do whatever they need to do to get the work done that they need to get done.
Oh, absolutely. And I think actually Nick Bryant and Whitney Webb talk a lot about how sexual blackmail is a key component of power in the United States.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the main thing that clip is saying is there are legal markets with state protection. You know, there's a certain amount of activity happening on the black market that the U.S. is cashing in on and involved in. And Whitney Webb starts her exploration of this in World War II with Operation Underworld. And Operation Underworld is before the formation of the OSS and the CIA, and the U.S. decides to partner with the National Crime Syndicate, what we would now call the National Crime Syndicate, to start to form their intelligence network. So, if you needed somebody taken out, you would go see the mafia for that, and that's who they went to originally. And ever since then, there's always been a certain level of cooperation or involvement with the U.S. government in illegal activities. And some of the things that she points to that have been documented and put out there is, we now know that the CIA was in fact selling drugs, right? We know about Iran-Contra. There are all of these markets that the U.S. is trying to cash in on, and the U.S. needs to cash in on. One of the interesting points that she made was that there needs to be this kind of generation of income behind the scenes so that the CIA can be involved with operations that are not approved by the Congress, right? So they want to do all these dirty dealing that they don't want Congress, that branch of the government, to know about, but they need to fund these things. So if they're selling drugs or selling guns or involved in this dirty business, it gives them the money they need to be able to operate.
Yeah, I think that John Kiriakou, what he's saying, this is kind of part of the conclusion that I drew from listening to a lot of the investigative journalists and some of the more authoritative voices who are analyzing the Epstein files, which is that Epstein was definitely some sort of cutout for intelligence and that he was a service provider for the financial rulers. And he was essentially moving money across borders for these companies, and he would do it through his philanthropical foundations and these shell companies. And that was all this dark money and what Kiriakou mentioned in terms of compromat, where damaging information is used as a weapon for blackmail and also used to influence policy. That is such a key component of what I think is going on here and what Cam and I kept stumbling across and finding, which is that these sexual crimes were happening and they're depraved, but a lot of them were for compromising and sexual blackmail and so on. So I think that's just a whole component of the underbelly to this that, once again, the media is missing.
Yeah, and that's the problem with looking at this is the sexual crimes are so sensational that all the attention is going there. And while those are terrible, horribly impacted the people who were the victims, the crimes that have a broader impact are financial, like crimes that have massively redistributed the wealth in this country. And I was really, really shocked to hear about the scale of some of that stuff.
The issue of intelligence services using sexual blackmail and honey traps, stuff is kind of the bread and butter of intelligence services.
Yeah, and once you're compromised, you all protect each other.
I have a question for you guys about potential consequences for all this. So Andrew Mountbatten, who I would suggest our listeners who don't know, look up the name Mountbatten and the crimes of the family of Mountbatten in Ireland and India and elsewhere. He was stripped of his royal position and recently arrested in Britain. There's been a number of Scandinavian politicians or royalty who have quit their jobs or positions. I believe the head of a Dubai port company who was associated with Epstein has left his position. Are these actual consequences, or are they actually part of the cover-up?
To me, it feels performative, and we don't even have that pretense in the U.S. We don't even have the performance. But yeah, that's what it feels like for me.
Yeah, I think it's all of whatever happens is a little slap on the wrist or whatever. It's all going to be theatrical. And I don't think any heads are going to roll about this. I don't think anyone's going to face consequences. One of the people that we follow on who's been really sharp on this is Caitlin Johnstone. And she had a short commentary on this. And as usual, it was very pithy and impactful. She said, quote, "The power structure which birthed the Epstein abuses is not going to do anything about the Epstein abuses. The only thing that might possibly change is that some people might become radicalized against that power structure." So I don't know. That's another question that I have for you guys, which is if you start digging into the Epstein files, most people, I think, will realize the world does not operate the way you're told it's operate. But what does that mean? If people's eyes are open to how dystopian this world is, how capitalism functions at its core, nothing has happened.
Knowledge is good, but knowledge in and of itself is not power. Just because you know something doesn't mean you can act on it. And a bunch of atomized, isolated individuals looking at their phone screens or computer screens and typing away about all the various crimes of Epstein and those around him doesn't mean anything is going to change. The American ruling class has reached a point where it doesn't care anymore what you know or don't know, because they hold all the power and they exercise it.
Yeah.
To give a very simple example, the overwhelming majority of the American populace opposes this war in Iran, and it makes no difference. They'll just do what they want to do. The majority of Americans oppose the Gaza genocide, and they'll just do what they want to do. For the first time, I think ever, at least since the late 60s, the majority of Americans oppose aid to Israel, and they'll just do what they want to do because we are irrelevant to them. Now, the way to become relevant is actually a question of organization and power. You know, we talked about an episode we did on ICE, confronting ICE with labor strikes. We talked about power means you're organized as a force that can act independent of these guys. It means you're not going to appeal to one set of politicians against another. It means building a party that actually represents the working class and that actually fights to overthrow these bastards. Then they'll have to deal with you. But until then, put it a different way. We all saw that Chomsky was part of this and apparently very close. And he's on his deathbed, so he can't really speak for himself. But
his wife can deny that. Oh, we didn't know.
Yeah, his wife, and she can say that Epstein wanted a close relationship with Chomsky so he can blackmail Chomsky, except no blackmail happened. It just got released in the files. I mean, I wasn't too shocked about this in the sense of I was never a huge fan of Chomsky. So I found him to be an anti-communist, the sort of oppositionist that an American ruling class can have to let off a bit of steam on an intellectual level. His work on linguistics is unparalleled, but that's not what we're talking about here. But like one of his most famous books is the one about manufacturing consent. And while that's a valuable and important book, one of the things you have to keep in mind is there are times when the ruling class doesn't need to manufacture consent. They can just do what they want.
Just on the linguistics things, there's actually a tie-in because Epstein was also really interested in large language models. And so part of connecting with Chomsky was on the linguistics thing and in artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and he was a brilliant linguist. While we're at it, I just want to do a little aside, a shout out to Norman Finkelstein. Now, Norman Finkelstein is somebody that I have my political differences with, but goddamn, I have always respected that guy. That guy gave up his tenure, or was deprived of his tenure, in defense of the Palestinians. So he's probably the only person who appears in the Epstein files whose stature is inflated by the Epstein files, because he responds to evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers trying to connect Finkelstein with the Epstein clan. And Norman responds that one should instead, quote, promptly throttle both Epstein and Dershowitz, and refuses to have anything to do with them.
The only correct response to that email.
Damn right. The only correct response to that damn email. No, as others have pointed out, that's probably how Finkelstein ends all his emails. But I just wanted to do a little shout out to Norman Finkelstein because it's very well deserved. But while we're at it, I will say it is fairly clear that a lot of Jewish names and a lot of Jewish supremacist statements come out clearly in the Epstein files. From Epstein himself saying, I work for the Rothschilds, to him going back and forth joking about the Goyim, or the non-Jews, as basically subhumans. There's obviously a lot of connections between Epstein and Israel, including him saying explicitly, I work to help Israel. So I don't know if you guys have noticed it. You tell me. There's been a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment in response to this on social media, like a sort of a rebirth of this, the Jews control the world stuff and the media and so on.
Yeah, I've seen a bit of that, and like Lola was mentioning that there's a certain amount of conspiracy that alibi the ruling class, and I would put that in the bucket where it's like this idea that evil Jews are controlling the world. So now that this comes out, all the people who held that belief are like, you see, this is what we've been talking about. So yes, I have been hearing that too.
So I think we should address this, even if briefly, because I don't want to just come out with some trite statement that says, oh, anti-Jewish bigotry is bad. I mean, well, it is. But I think there's something deeper to be dug here. I think we talked earlier about how Epstein was a cog in the machine. And there's a lot of talk about how powerful and well connected he was. But I think it's also important to talk about how he fell, the fact that he did fall. If you are so incredibly powerful, how did he fall? And I think it's useful to understand the role that somebody like an Epstein plays. And it may provide not only a window into how the class enemy thinks, but also how it works. So for me to express this point, I have to step back in history. So let's play a thought experiment. Let's pretend you are a peasant somewhere in Poland or one of the little feudal estates in Germany in the medieval period. You work your ass off.
How did you know this was my typical role-playing game?
Yeah, I know you. You work your butt off. We'll say you're the male, the head of the household. Your wife has given birth to 12 children. Half of them have died because that's the infant mortality rate. The ones that are remaining are supposed to work the land. You barely have a subsistence existence. Your life is short, ugly, and brutish. And twice a year, this Jewish guy comes around to collect the taxes. He is guarded by a bunch of soldiers. He collects the taxes for the king or for the local lord and, keeps a little for himself. To you, this is an all-powerful man. He holds essentially life and death over you.
He's the direct face.
Yeah, and to you, that is the face that you encounter. You don't encounter the lord or the king. You're going to encounter the tax collector.
Yeah, you don't think of the shadowy figures that are behind it or pulling the strings or... Mm-hmm.
Right. But that power is actually, in reality, limited because it plays the middleman role. It plays the role between the king or the lord who actually owns the land and the peasant. And it's useful to the king who owns the land because when the peasants revolt, or when you, as the lord, have no more use for this guy, the peasants aren't going to go after you. You're up in a castle on a hill protected. They're going to go after the middleman, the person who hurt them twice a year on an annual basis. And then, the Lord can launch a pogrom in a town that's a few miles away that's mainly made up of Jews and get rid of the problem or redirect the anger. There is a reason why the German socialist leader August Bebel in the 19th century called anti-Jewish bigotry the socialism of fools, because you're going after the wrong target. And in a certain sense, Epstein played that role of the tax collector. Now, in medieval times, the reason you had Jewish tax collectors is because Jews were not allowed to own land. Jews were not allowed to even be peasants. There was no such thing as a Jewish peasant. You basically were the one who was dealing with money because that was the only thing that was allowed to you. And you provided a service in what Belgian Marxist Abraham Leon, who was killed in the Holocaust, called a service in the pores of medieval society, in those areas where the medieval society itself didn't cover. It's not by law today, but you used to, in the early 20th century, have a section of the American Jewish population that was part of the working class. And that's really not true anymore. It's more of a middle-class populace. And when you talk about powerful Jews in America today, they occupy that middling position where they seem very powerful to those below them or even to themselves, but are not the real holders of power. The real holders of power is the capitalist class, which is overwhelmingly white and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant. And I think it's important to understand the role that Epstein played. And it's a similar thing to the very first episode we had. Who's in charge, the U.S. or Israel? It's the U.S. Who's in charge, Epstein or the people above him? It's the ruling class that's above him.
Yeah, and Israel doesn't do Jews any favor by equating Judaism with pro-Israel sentiment and Zionism. And so basically, if you're trying to make sense of the ties with the state of Israel and you see that as Jews running society because you think that Israel is running things or that Israel is behind everything, then that's obviously going to just exacerbate anti-Jewish sentiment.
Yeah, and you're right. Israel promotes that line, but so does the United States. It's not just Israel that promotes it. Everybody from secular American politicians like the Barack Obamas to the crazed religious fanatics. I mean, it's hilarious to watch American politicians today talk about Iran being run by religious fanatics when you look at the troglodyte Neanderthals that run this country, who speak in tongue and talk about defending Israel because they have a biblical obligation to. Not even a strategic partnership with, but a biblical obligation to. This country is run by a bunch of medieval-minded religious fanatics.
And Trump is the holiest of them all.
Yeah, I think you're making a great point, Ezra, because that's another thing that's come out with all these emails is how much of a connector Jeffrey Epstein was. One of the audios that leaked was between the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, and Jeffrey Epstein. And Jeffrey Epstein is like, have you heard of this amazing company called Palantir? So it seems like he just really did have his hand in a million different buckets and was the connective tissue between all the evil things.
Right. We talked about his ties to Israeli intelligence. I think he's also tied to American intelligence. Because let me put it to you this way. If he was tied to Israeli intelligence, there is no way American intelligence didn't know that. And American intelligence tried to use him for their own purposes. So, for example, that very phone call you referred to, where neither of them seems to know how to spell Peter Thiel's name or Palantir's, but he knew what Palantir and Peter Thiel was. And Ehud Barak, who shockingly was the former head of military intelligence in Israel, didn't. I mean, just again,
yeah,
that
it shows how
gives
inside
you
he is.
Yeah, and it also gives you the sense of who is in charge of this relationship. He introduced them to Ehud Barak, and lo and behold, of course, unconnected to anything, a year and a half or 2 years later, Palantir has a great contract with the Israeli government. The man is well connected to a lot of evil, nefarious and powerful forces, but when he becomes unuseful to those forces, he gets offed or conveniently commits suicide.
I think going back to the biggest takeaway is for people who are exploring this is the connections between organized crime, intelligence, Wall Street, the State Department, the capitalists. This is what you're pointing out in terms of this is the bourgeoisie, right? And once you kind of see that all these financial figures and criminal thugs at like the highest pinnacle of the state have control over everything, of course there's going to be no accountability.
All these things you described are just different expressions of either the ruling class or institutions that exist to work with and facilitate the ruling class. And I go back to saying, if you throw everybody whose name appears in the Epstein file, if you launch them to the moon, it will still be part of the cover-up. Because these people are going to die of natural causes anyway. There's just going to be a whole new crop of them coming up to fill those very same roles and become the new nefarious ruling class.
And the network is still operating. And I think that's the other thing, that there's no way that Epstein didn't have a continuation. There's no way that this kind of stuff isn't still going on. And that's what also makes it so criminal, that the media is kind of like, I mean, we all saw Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton being interrogated. I don't know if interrogated or whatever, but
Interrogated. Okay.
questioned.
Waterboard
Questioned kindly, you know, and it's like whatever they were to say, it's presented as what were your like everything is in the past, you know, what were your ties, like it's a closed chapter or whatever. I think that is part of the, you call it the cover up, Ezra, the distraction, whatever. This is all still going on.
It's all very much still going on, and Epstein was, like Ezra says, a cog in the machine. It wasn't like he is the perpetrator, he is the ringleader, he is the mastermind. He is one player in a bigger game. And
a
powerful player for sure. But
I am not denying that. An incredibly powerful player.
But not like this lone mastermind, you know? Like, he is a part of a machine for sure. Like we were saying earlier, the financial crimes that well, you know what? I'm saying financial crimes because they are amoral and bad. But, like, really, a lot of this stuff is legal crimes, which is crazy.
Yep.
I was reading Whitney Webb, and Whitney Webb talked about how Jeffrey Epstein was involved with these huge manipulations of the global economy and redistributing massive amount of wealth. And one of the things that she writes about is not really something that comes from the Epstein files, but something that's a public knowledge. Have you guys heard anything about the SDG 17 sustainable goals that the United Nations is putting forth?
I've heard of it. I know nothing about it.
All right, so this is a program.
It's not on my Pinterest mood board.
Well, it should not be unless you're evil. But yeah, so this is a program that's being put forth by the United Nations. And what it's designed to do is it's supposed to build up developing nations and bring them into a more modern, sustainable world. So the SDG 17 is all of these goals, and the goals are designed to eradicate poverty, free the world from tyranny, achieve gender equality, end hunger. So like all these things that sound really, really good. But what it actually entails is all of these developing countries need to acquire debt from industrialized countries in order to build up their country and to meet the goals of this program. So there's like a certain amount of debt that is expected for them to acquire, and they're rebranding the old idea of a debt for land swap as a conservation swap. So the way this works essentially is once a country becomes indebted, then they can trade land to take away some of their debt. So if you're like a Caribbean island, don't worry, you can just give us the Caribbean Sea and that'll take care of your debt. So we're looking at a future where Michael Bloomberg can own the Caribbean Sea. And if you want to get a fish out of the sea, you got to pay Michael Bloomberg. Another thing that's on this list of privatizing of the natural world is Bill Gates has come out and he says, I need all of the cobalt in the world to reach my technology goals. So like there could be a future that we're looking at where Bill Gates owns the Andes Mountains, which are full of cobalt, right? So Whitney Webb called this the financialization of the natural world and charging you for its services. So yeah, dude, we're like coming to a point where like the capitalists are gonna fucking try to charge you for the air that you breathe. And the way that this is related to Epstein is Ghislaine Maxwell founded the company Terramar, and Terramar was the branch of this program that is privatizing oceans.
That makes sense. I would argue that from what you're describing, this is just the next step of indebting so-called third world countries. They've done it. I don't know if you guys remember.
I was gonna say like IMF, World Bank. Okay, yeah,
exactly, exactly. Or the whole structure of the European Union. An example I was going to give is if you remember the massive debt crisis in Greece. Where did that come from? The German banks basically pumped money into Greece. And yeah, take on more debt. Oh yeah, we'll build this infrastructure, we'll build out, take on more debt, take on more. And then comes the time to pay. And you're not allowed to restructure your debt. You're not allowed to devalue your currency because you're stuck on the euro. You're not allowed to do anything. And this is Greece. This isn't like the world's poorest country, but it has still not recovered from this. This is what they do. They're just coming up with new and different ways of doing it. And the new and different ways are even more nefarious. You know, if I can just make this point, there's another side to all the focus on the sexual crimes. Every documentary I've seen, every news report I've seen, at least in the main bourgeois media, has focused on the American victims. And there were plenty of American victims. But there were also, as far as I can tell, just numerically, a hell of a lot of victims from East Europe, the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Nobody gives a damn about them because they ain't American. Nobody talks about them. Nobody knows what's happened to them. Nobody knows how many of them committed suicide. Nobody knows anything about them because they're basically considered children of a lesser god. Some of them, emblematic of the Melanias, ended up being, marrying into
the marriage property.
Into the property. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to refer to another quote, this is from Marx and Engels from the Communist Manifesto. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives and daughters of the proletarians at their disposal, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is in reality a system of wives in common. They desire to replace a hypocritically concealed with a blatantly organized community of women.
Can I just say it like blows my mind how they were clocking this stuff like more than 100 years ago?
This is 1848. This is like 170 years ago.
That's like 200 years ago.
Engels, The Origin of the Family. The ruling class remains under the sway of the old economic influences, and therefore, in their case, examples of really loving marriages are the exception. The marriage of convenience often turns into the crassest prostitution, sometimes on both sides, but much more generally on the part of the wife, who differs from the ordinary courtesan only in that she does not hire out her body like a wage worker on piecework, but sells it into slavery once and for all to her husband. This is how, for example, old aristocracy worked. You have daughters, you sell them into marriage, so you can forge alliances. And one other thing. So they talk about these, what was this UN thing called?
The SDG 17.
What a catchy name. They talk about the SDG 17 as a way to lift poor countries out of poverty, which anybody can tell you is not obviously what they have in mind. But behind that is just turning these countries into just massive factories of servitude for the imperialist ruling classes. And the violence and brutality that you see in the Epstein files is the norm, actually, of how the ruling class of the West functions in these third world societies. That is what their soldiers do. It's what they do. It's part of terrorizing people. It's part of controlling people. So I want to play a couple of clips. They're very difficult to listen to clips. So the warning here is these clips will have brutal descriptions of rape and torture at the hands of American soldiers towards victims that they don't consider to be human beings. So the first clip is from a bunch of soldiers returning from Vietnam. I believe this is the early 1970s, describing what they witnessed from their fellow soldiers towards the Vietnamese. And I, again, want to stress the warning. These are very brutal and that describe in gruesome detail sexual and other forms of violence.
The cutting off of heads on Operation Stone, there was a lieutenant colonel there, and 2 people had their heads cut off and put on stakes and stuck in the middle of the field.
He went over there and ripped her clothes off and took a knife and cut from her vagina all the way up, well, just about up to her breast, and pulled her organs out, completely out of her cavity, and threw them out. And then he stopped and knelt over and commenced to peel every bit of skin off her body and left her there as a sign for something or other.
And there were 2 little boys playing on the dike, and one sergeant just took his M16 and shot one boy off the dike. The other boy tried to run, and he was almost out of sight. This other guy, Spec 4, he shot this other little boy off the dike, and the little boy was like lying on the ground kicking. So he shot him again to make sure he's dead.
These people are aware of what American soldiers do to them, so naturally they try to hide the young girls. We found one hiding in a bomb shelter in sort of the basement of her house. She was taken out, raped by 6 or 7 people in front of her family, in front of most of the villagers. This wasn't just one instance, this is just the first one that I could remember.
It got to be like a game, like the object was to see who could kill the most people. And the different ways you could prove how many people you killed would be like cutting off ears. Now, if you brought back someone's ears, you know, pretty likely you had to kill them to get them. And then people would, you know, whoever had the most ears, they would get the most beers, and you'd trade your ears for beers.
As I was walking over to him, I turned and I looked in the area. I looked to where the VCS were, supposed VCS. And 2 men were leading a young girl, approximately 19 years old, very pretty, out of a hooch. She had no clothes on, so I assumed she had been raped, which was pretty SOP. And that's standard operating procedure for civilians. And she was thrown onto the pile of the 19 women and children, and 5 men around the circle opened up on full automatic with their M16s. And that was the end of that.
And lest you think, oh, that was Vietnam, that was different. This is from 2008. Whereas the one from Vietnam were soldiers trying to convey to Americans the atrocities that the American troops were committing in Vietnam. These are American soldiers in Iraq bragging about the atrocities that they committed.
So the savagery is a feature. It's not an accident.
Give me a fucking break. You know, what's the big deal about making a hot sheet walk around like a dog and bark? Did anyone get all upset?
What else would you guys do?
Yeah. What we did. Or we take plastic and wrap it around their heads until they start. I mean, CIA showed us a lot of shit, man. Drink generator. Where we hook it up. Yeah, we're gonna hook it up to their nipples or their nuts.
Ooh, ouch.
Shock the shit out of them.
Yeah. What was the most fun things?
The most fun thing, definitely the women.
Yeah? They had chicken surgeons, man?
No, really? No, they don't have chicken surgeons. Something goes down, they just grab everyone around, fuck them. I mean, you're going to have 35 trials? No, people are like, oh, they're innocent. You know what? I don't give a fuck them. They fucked up.
Fucking do anything.
Fucking them. Yeah. Fuck them, dude. Anyone with a fucking rag on their head is fair game. Girl. She's probably like 15 years old. Oh, yeah? Yeah, she's fun, dude. Body on that girl. Really tight.
They always wear it like you can't see them, right?
I hadn't been touched yet. She was fucking prime.
Oh.
So, guys, he started pimping her out for $50 a shot. I think at the end of the day, he made like $500 before she hung herself. Really? Yeah.
She hung herself? How come she hung herself?
I don't know. She wasn't happy. It was culture that's really shunned upon if you get raped. I guess she would have been stoned to death anyways by her people. Yeah. It's fucked up.
Well, she was fucked anyway, I guess.
Yeah.
These are the people that are going to liberate Iran.
These are sick, racist, misogynist freaks who are running society. And what they commit abroad and what they do at home and how they revel in it and gloat about it is basically what we're seeing as in the Epstein files.
Exactly. So the reason I played these very gruesome clips and the reason I mentioned the East European women is because what you are seeing and what you find shocking is the norm of what these people do when they land their troops in these foreign countries. They do not think of these people as human beings. And it's, again, not a bug. It is, of course, a crime, but not a crime in the sense that it goes against what the laws of what they think should happen is. It is how it's supposed to work.
Well, the law is for them. The law is to keep them in power. That's what bourgeois law is in society.
So knowing the depraved nature of our ruling class, they're never going to let any crime affect them. So one thing I can foresee is the possibility or even likelihood that the Epstein files and what's revealed with them are going to be used to promote a sexual hysteria in this country that will land a lot of people in prison, as it has in the past. Whenever these guys talk about the children, supposedly protecting the children, they are usually using these sympathies to ram through a massive diminution of democratic rights. How do you see that playing out, and how has it played out in the past?
One point I want to make about this is that in this country, the public will always grasp onto anti-sex witch hunts that are manufactured by the state, and the government will use mass hysteria and moral outrage to stoke fear and push ideological conformity. This is always hypocritically paraded as protecting the children, and of course that diverts attention from the real crimes that are carried out against children every day, not only abroad, but here in this country. We live in a country that regularly denies children like basic needs, food and shelter. I mean, the predator boogeyman, whatever, the pedophilia hysteria has been used for a long time. And that definition has always been very broad. And people who are accused of it don't have the means to defend themselves or the financial support and connections to be able to avoid accountability. So let's just look at what some of the material that you just shared, Ezra, in terms of the intense sexual crimes and carrying out imperialist war. And then you think about the sex hysteria that has existed in the United States. The satanic sex ring panic in the 80s and 90s, hundreds of innocent people, daycare employees in particular, were framed up on these charges of raping and torturing children. Psychologists implanted false memories during therapy. And the ideological backdrop to this was stay-at-home mother. You need stay-at-home mothers as opposed to the evils of childcare, right? In the process of this, so many lives were destroyed. For years, there's been this obsession with catching a predator. Anyone who gets accused of pedophilia, that accusation sticks. So Pee Wee Herman had his career ruined for being in an adult theater, and then later was framed up on child porn charges when it was clear that it was vintage art. The sex police go after millions of people, put them on these sex offender registries, turn them into social outcasts and pariahs for life. These laws that fuel these intense dragnets and all this social hysteria, and the biggest abusers are sitting in Washington. The hypocrisy is so profound, and both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, push family values, and that's just a way of keeping the family, quote unquote, intact, like this horrible straitjacket of religious guilt and criminal abuse. A lot of the girls who were trafficked by Epstein came from abusive households or were trafficked by their family. If you actually look at the way that these beasts at the highest pinnacle of society lured their victims, abused them, exploited them, and then said that they were all lying. One victim that a lot of people point to is Virginia Giuffre. She was one of the more prominent abuse survivors. There are hundreds of others. She committed suicide, but you can look at her account. There's a Epstein Victims Compensation Fund, which hundreds have applied for. If you get a settlement from that fund, you have to sign an NDA that you can't name any perpetrators.
It's a hush money deal.
Mm-hmm.
Precisely because they know who the perpetrators are.
Mm-hmm. The rulers will tout this morality. They're raping and selling women. They're forcing them to have babies in the anti-abortion laws. The sexual witch hunt and hysteria always goes after the poor and the people who don't have those connections. It's never directed to those at the top. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
You mentioned Pee Wee Herman. One of the figures I remember that's been dragged through the mud under these allegations was Michael Jackson.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned Michael Jackson because that actually has come up a lot in the Epstein files. One of the things that people are speculating on Michael Jackson is that he was essentially killed trying to protect children from Epstein. And a lot of people are saying that Neverland was like the safe house he was helping kids hide from like real Hollywood predators. There's also people who are playing clips of Michael Jackson saying like, they're coming for me. I have no idea if this is real or not, but I do know that a lot of people in this world have accepted the witch hunt against Michael Jackson. I never did. The FBI conducted extensive investigations and surveillance of Jackson for like over a decade, and they were intent on finding a way to frame a black man for molesting white children, and they could not produce a shred of evidence, including FBI documents published online. He was found not guilty in various trials, and up until he died, he said these relationships were platonic. But he was crucified, and that's what I want to focus on here, is that like these laws, like age of consent laws, were typically used to go against black men. Now we have child abuse happening in the open, and people are still posthumously dragging Michael Jackson's name and reputation through the mud.
Yeah, while the real perpetrators sit right there.
Yeah.
Unflaunted. The people who rape, murder, and brutalize children, and I don't just mean the stuff that's in the Epstein file. I mean the daily existence of poor and working class people in this country and around the world are just running around like they own the place because they own the place. It's not just unique to Epstein and his type.
Yep, and all of the opposition is pageantry. And I think we really saw that during the Pam Bondi hearings, where Pam Bondi was there, you know, talking about how great the Dow is and how disrespectful it is that we're even talking about these subjects. And there are the Democrats saying, this is disgusting. How could you? And then everybody gets to go home and, you know, they got to perform for their base. The job is done. And that's it. We pat ourselves on the back.
I guess part of the thing about sex with this whole thing is a lot of people assumed that because sexual predation and criminal abuse is such a hot point in American witch hunts and also in American society and in fueling moral panic, that this kind of exposure was going to suddenly shake things up. And it's not. So in 2023, Nick Bryant on his podcast actually interviewed Whitney Webb, and he was basically arguing that this is going to be the only opportunity in our lifetime to bring a sea change in the government. Once all this is exposed, people are going to open their eyes, and they're not. I mean, as much as you try to expose the scandals, these are the people in power, the Democrats and the Republicans, and the sick depravity behind it is all there. The narrative is still being controlled. I would like to just hear what Whitney Webb says in response to this idea that exposing this is going to bring about massive change. This is an excerpted segment of the interview, and we'll link out to the full interview in the show notes.
But do you think that if enough people augured into Epstein and really started to expose what Epstein was about, I mean, enough people, that could bring about a sea change in our government?
So I think Epstein is a unique opportunity because it garnered so much attention, both from independent and mainstream media, that he's essentially a household name and he's universally recognized as bad, right? So by drilling into him and what he was really doing and who really supported him, that's what I tried to do in my books and in my work. I'm trying to use that as a vehicle, really Epstein as a vehicle to expose how power actually works in this country, the crimes they commit against innocent people every day. And, the nature and extent of the corruption, because if you don't know what the problem is, there's really no way to solve it, right? If you think the issue is just, the mainstream media narrative about Epstein, oh, he was just a sex trafficker and now he's dead, so everything's fine again. No, the network that enabled him continues to exist, and Epstein was obviously expendable, so there's someone that's filled his shoes for whatever reason. And in today's paradigm, sexual blackmail, as Epstein and other people in history used it, is not necessarily as relevant because of the mass surveillance state and the technology of today that makes it easier than ever to blackmail people. It's really important to expose, again, the extent of the corruption, because, voting for, left or right, Democrat and Republican is not going to change the system. What will change it is massive awareness and massive non-compliance. And I really think, that's the way forward. And voting for, between two different associates of Epstein, a Clinton and a Trump or something like that, how much is that really going to change these power structures that we're talking about? It's not. So again, that's why I think it's important to bring this broader picture into view, because if you believe the mainstream media narrative, you're not really going to be understanding what the nature of the problem we're facing.
The only thing that will change this is the overthrow of capitalist rule through a working class revolution. Otherwise, nothing will change. Look, there's been a lot of talk about sex trafficking, and rightly so, but the trafficking of human beings is a feature of capitalism, whether it's sexual or otherwise. It can take on the expression of sexual trafficking, like we've been talking about this episode. It can take on the expression of outright slavery. And I don't just mean the historical example. I mean the fact that when they overthrew Gaddafi, for example, in Libya in 2011, you literally had slave markets in Libya afterwards, where human beings were bought and sold. We just had an episode on immigration. When the economy is doing badly, they deport the immigrants. When the economy is doing well and they need cheap labor, they bring in immigrants to be super exploited. That is human trafficking. That is trafficking in people to be used for labor and then expendable afterwards. This is a feature of how the capitalist order works on different levels, whether it's sexual, whether it's outright slavery, whether it's super exploited wage slavery. When these people talk about Epstein and his co-conspirators, the real issue is Epstein was the co-conspirator. The real people who run this stuff is the capitalist class.
Well, Epstein was actually just an agent of Madagascar.
Yes. The feared intelligence service of Madagascar.
So who do you guys think the new Jeffrey Epstein is now that the old Jeffrey Epstein has been disposed?
There are so many of them.
I think it's very suspicious how Guy Fieri all of a sudden changed his whole look. Maybe he's the guy.
What about Jim Carrey?
Oh, yes. Yeah, that's why he can't show his face in public anymore, because real Jim Carrey was running a sex ring and fake Jim Carrey attended the award show.
Yeah, exactly. Anytime a celebrity has fillers, we should just be like, part of the Epstein files.
We might be right 50% of the time. Mm-hmm. Maybe the new Epstein is Chelsea Clinton. Who could know? Because Maxwell was at her wedding.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Unwashed and Unruly. You can get all our episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you fill your ear holes. And make sure to review, like, subscribe, and do all the clickety-clack things so that we can beat the algorithm.